Turning the Forums podcast. I'm Nick.
I'm Anthony.
And we're here with an exciting guest. He's a Christian philosopher. He is the Professor Emeritus of the College of New Jersey. He served as Professor of Philosophy, Religion, and Logic at the college since 1968. And he's just an all-around awesome philosopher who knows Herman Dooyeweerd. And so I'm excited to have him on the show. His name's Roy Clouser. Roy, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
I'm sorry I cut you guys off. You were in conversation, and I that was my problem. That was
bad manners, man. We were having a nice talk about the work they had to do to get the degree. Yeah, we can talk about that stuff here too. I think it'd be interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Because the good thing is of just cutting you guys off is you can tell the audience. So what was graduate school like for you, Roy?
I had to work to support myself and pay tuition and books and so on. It was all the way through college, seminary, and graduate school. My dear parents were very strong Christians, passed that faith on to me, and I'm very grateful for it. But they were also products of the Philadelphia School of the Bible, which was an extreme fundamentalist group that was opposed to higher ed. So when my parents talked to me about college, it was only one conversation, and it went, we don't see why any Christian would go to college. It's just a place that ridicules your faith. But if you decide you want to go, don't look to us for help. And that was the first and last conversation we had about that.
So you worked hard.
Yes. And there's not much sleep involved there. But at one point when I finished, I did my undergraduate work at Gordon College. I got an AB in philosophy. Then I got a BD in theology at Reformed Episcopal Seminary in Philadelphia. And I applied around a number of places, and I had gotten several rejections when the GRE exams came back. Will your audience know what that is? It's an exam in the U.S. You take a whole series of comprehensive exams as entrance to graduate school, and those turn out real well. So on a dare, I applied to Harvard, and on a wild whim, I got accepted.
That's great.
So I started graduate school in the program called the History and Philosophy of Religion at Harvard, and it was a wonderful year in one respect. I had a whole cavalcade of stars for professors. I had 3 courses with Paul Tillich, and I had R. Richard Niebuhr for 19th century and Heiko Obermann for medieval history, and it just goes on and on.
That's amazing.
And I loved it. Of course, it was difficult in other ways. 1 meal a day and no meat for the winter, for example. But at any rate, I couldn't go back for the second year because Harvard at that time would not accept government loans as student payment. The University of Pennsylvania, which is another Ivy League school and had a very fine philosophy department, would. So I applied to Penn and transferred. I was supporting myself, by the way, as in Cambridge, as this is the official title, as minister in charge of the Evangelical United Brethren Church of Central Square, Cambridge. My salary was $2,800 a year. And so when I went to transfer to Penn, I tossed my hat in the ring at Philadelphia Council of Churches, and I got a position as assistant pastor of St. Andrew's Methodist Church with a raise of $1,100 a year.
Shorter title, bigger pay. That's nice.
Slightly bigger.
Nice. Yeah, slightly bigger, but still bigger.
700. These are
right.
These are hundreds, not thousands.
So, right.
Yeah. Okay. I think you get the picture, and I won't go on with that. But anyway, I was able to get the government loans to pay the Penn tuition. So that's what precipitated the transfer, and it transferred me to a straight out philosophy program. Penn didn't have a program in philosophy and religion or history of philosophy of religion or anything like that, but they had a religion department or a philosophy department. It was really quite distinct. I transferred to Penn, and I had very good people there to work with. And my advisor, James Ross, a very sharp analytic philosopher who was also a Christian. He was a practicing Catholic. And he really whipped you into shape. You learned how to think and how to make an argument and present it. And he was my supervisor, my bishop. I proposed writing on the idea of a Christian philosophy as that had been developed by these Dutch Calvinists, Herman Dooyeweerd and Berkel and Hoven and others. He approved it. You have to get your project approved, you know. He proved it in his own inimitable way. He said, we're going to approve this dissertation on two conditions. One is that you go there and work on it with him. And the second is that he writes me a letter and says, you got him straight. Nobody's going to read all that stuff and examine you on whether you got him right. He says you got him right, we examine you on whether you think he is right. And the rest of that story that you described as humorous was my footnote that a Ph.D. dissertation defense is not the same in the U.S. as it is in Europe. In Europe, if your dissertation is approved, there's going to be an oral defense, but it's a formality. And you invite your friends and relatives and you hire a caterer and you have a big celebration because you're going to get the degree. In the United States, that is not true. When I first got to Penn, the story that was circulating among all the graduate students that had them all terrified was a story about a guy who did all the coursework, passed the PhD exams, passed the language exams, got a dissertation topic, wrote on that for several years. Everybody agreed. He and his committee both liked what shape it was in, came up for the oral defense and failed. He decided he would not let that defeat him. He got a new topic from the new committee, wrote another dissertation, came up for defense and failed.
Oh, no.
And that was, talk about, yeah.
Just so much work. So much work to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that story was circulating all around the Penn campus when I arrived. It's pretty terrifying.
So it boded well for your hopes and your dreams for your
for
your dissertation. Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a funny story.
It's an interesting one.
It's interesting, but it doesn't. It's not my idea of humor.
Right. Yeah. No.
If you want funny stories, I can tell you.
Yeah.
When I first got to Reformed Episcopal Seminary, my background I was raised a Baptist. Mm-hmm. Again, I say that my
fundamentalist
were fundamentalists, yes. And now I'm entering seminary, and I'm not sure what to expect. And it's in the Anglican tradition. And of course, the building is Gothic, and the professors
bells and smells.
But that's not the biggest change. The biggest change is we have serious scholarship going on here, folks. So my first week, I attend chapel, which is on Wednesdays, and in chapel, the seniors preach, and they are graded by a faculty member. So I go into the room and I sit down. Two seniors conduct the service from the Book of Common Prayer, and they each give a short sermon. And there's a professor sitting in the back of the room. He was my elementary Greek prof. This professor was about 6'3" or 4". and he had what looked like a dueling scar over one eye. And he was a Prussian. And he walked, and now one of these sermons I thought was one of the worst mishmashes I ever heard in my life. With no training, I could have preached a better sermon than that. And so this guy walks to the front of the room after the two seniors are done. And I'm wondering, how is he going to tell this guy politely, though, that this is awful? I needn't have worried. It's at the front of the room, and he says, in a voice like the Jolly Green Giant, that sermon was a stench in the nostrils of God.
My gosh.
I guess you don't have to put up on your grade.
Yeah, that's like a nightmare.
Can only get better from there, right?
Yeah. And I told that story to someone who was an older man who was a graduate of the seminary, and he said, "Oh, I can tell you a better one than that. When I was a student gave a terrible sermon, and the critic was Bishop Rudolph." Now, you two fellows may already know this. I have to say this as background for our viewers. In the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, there's a story about a false prophet named Balaam. And in this story, a pagan king hires Balaam to go put a curse on Israel. And he goes up a mountain or something, and he's overlooking the Israeli encampment. And he's about to go through this when the angel of the Lord speaks to him through his donkey and tells him he better go home. Forget this. Okay, that's the story. All right. So the prophet's name is Balaam. And that's what Bishop Rudolph used when he got up. He got up and he said to this fellow, "Young man, tell me the truth. Did you prepare that?" And the student said, "No, Bishop, I didn't." He said, "I was just reading in the gospel this week in the Gospels where Jesus said to his disciples not to worry about what to say when the time came, because the Holy Spirit to put the words in their mouth." And Bishop said, "Young man, God put the word into the mouth of Balaam's ass too, but he was still an ass."
That's a perfect rejoinder to that statement. It's literally a perfect rejoinder.
That is a good story.
Fantastic.
Oh my goodness.
That's good.
Yeah. Anyway, that gives you the flavor of the place.
Right.
And
yeah,
I finished there and then started graduate school at Harvard and transferred to Penn, finished at Penn. Yeah.
Wow. So you have this rich background, and what I think is neat. Now this is something I've heard, and I just get confirmation from you. I've heard that you're the last living philosopher who studied under Herman Dooyeweerd. Is that correct?
As far as I know, it's true.
Yeah.
There are other people still living who met him and talked with him.
Right. But you actually studied and completed the PhD.
Went back, yeah. It wasn't a formal setting. It wasn't in a university course. I went to Amsterdam the summer of 1967 in order to confer with him, and there's a story about that too. You would find interesting. When I first arrived, the secretary of the philosophy department went over with me the schedule they had sent up. I mean, the secretary of the philosophy department of the Free University of Amsterdam. So on Monday you see Vollenhoven, and this day you see Klopwijk, and this day so and Van Riesen and so on. And then next Tuesday you see Dooyeweerd. And I said, "There's only one appointment?" I mean, I took an advance on my salary to come for the summer, and and you only have one appointment. And he said, "Well, he's retired. It's up to him if he wants to see you again." I mean, so I see all these other people for the first week I'm there, and every one of them told me, "You're not understanding him right." Every single one of them.
Wow.
No, not Vollenhoven. Vollenhoven didn't say that, and neither did Van Riesen. But all the people that were the other younger people did. They all said, "No, that you got it wrong." So now it's Tuesday, and I'm on a tram going to his house to meet with him, and I'm wondering how am I going to get him to invite me back. So I went up to his study, and he was very gracious. How can I help you? And I said, well, I've been here a week, and almost everybody I've talked to has told me I'm not understanding you correctly. So why don't I start by telling you what I think is going on in the New Critique of Theoretical Thought. This is his big work. It's 3 volumes. And you stop me when I'm wrong. He said, go ahead. So I went on for 40 minutes. And he started to laugh. He said, who told you that's wrong? That's what I wanted to hear.
Nice. That's
like 40 minutes. That's a pretty good.
It was long. Yeah, it was over half
long
an
time. Yeah,
over half an hour. Who told you that's wrong? And then he shook his head. There's so many misunderstandings. So I said, well, if it's right, then I do have a problem. And I took a sheet of paper and I put the main claims of the New Critique down in logical notation. I put the main conclusion down in logical notation and constructed a proof that it was an invalid argument and gave it to him. So he looked at that and he said, well, nobody ever made that criticism before. But it was obvious when you do it that way, what's missing. There's another alternative that needs to be ruled out. And so we started to talk about how to do that. Mm-hmm. And then he looked at his watch and he said, well, it's getting kind of late. When can you come back?
Oh, now you got the invite back. Yeah.
So so then I saw him once a week for the rest of the summer.
So if you had, I was gonna say, if you had like a short pitch, if somebody doesn't know or know who Herman Dooyeweerd is and kind of what the importance of his is, what's like your short sales pitch about, how to explain it,
Okay.
Yeah.
The vast majority of Christian thinkers for the whole history of Christianity have thought that Christian philosophy is not possible. There is Christian theology, but there's no philosophy. Philosophy aims at 2 things: a theory of reality, what's the nature of reality, and a theory of knowledge, what's the essential nature of knowledge. The first has a proper name. It's called ontology. It's sometimes nicknamed metaphysics. The second is epistemology, theory of knowledge. There's no way Christian thinkers thought, to construct a theory of the ultimate nature of created reality, or the ultimate nature of knowledge that's uniquely Christian. Beginning in the 19th century, there was a group of Dutch Calvinists who came to a different conclusion. Given the way Scripture speaks about the renovation of the human heart and the way that knowing God should reorient us toward all of reality, they came to the conclusion that there should be such a thing possible. And there was one great champion of this view, a man named Abraham Kuyper, who wrote theology, wrote philosophy, founded the Free University of Amsterdam, founded a Christian political party, and was a political activist. He was elected Prime Minister of the Netherlands about the same time Teddy Roosevelt was President of the United States. Kuyper died in 1920. Herman Dooyeweerd was a man of great ability. People knew that about him, and he was raised in a household that was that idolized Kuyper. So he was raised on Kuyper's thought, and he thought that Kuyper was right about that. But Kuyper, even in his later old age, said, "We've cleared the ground for the Christian philosophy, but as yet no building has been erected on the ground." And Dooyeweerd decided that he would have a go at that. And he and his brother-in-law, Dirk Vollenhoven, both went deliberately into philosophy, not theology, with the idea of constructing a Christian philosophy. I can explain that later in more detail, if you like, about just that difference, why people thought it wasn't possible, and the insight that they came up with that led them to believe it was possible and necessary.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
But anyway, I had heard about that. I had heard that something like that was going on. And in my senior year at Reformed Episcopal Seminary, Dooyeweerd came and gave 5 lectures in Philadelphia, and I went and heard them. And I was even more fascinated with that. And I got the new critique and started to read it and so on. So it was that was just a pipe dream to be able to go there and work on that with him. But it happened.
Yeah, that's amazing. So we want to kind of get into your philosophy and of course, how you've understood Dooyeweerd. And but one of the things that you mentioned that was really interesting to me is you said you studied for a little bit under, or you took a class from Paul Tillich.
3.
Correct. Three classes. And, he's famous for defining religion, right?
Yes.
Or at least coming up with his own take, and and there's a lot of that going on.
He defines faith as ultimate concern.
Okay, ultimate concern.
And then he was asked repeatedly by people, well, does that mean concern about what's ultimate, or what I'm most importantly concerned with right now?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And he said both, but that doesn't really make it fly. I only had one conversation with him. We were walking out, leaving a class, and happened to be walking together up the hall. And I asked him about that, and I said, what relation has the idea of ultimate concern to what Luther says in the larger catechism when he says, what does it mean to have a God? As I have often said, faith and trust of the heart make both God or an idol. If your faith is right, you have the true God. If not, you have an idol. But whatever your heart clings to is really your God. And he went, that's where I got it.
That's good. That's interesting. So, so when I think of a Christian philosophy, and so before we kind of get into trying to scope that out and see if it's even possible, the term Christian, implies that we're already assuming there's a God, we have this religious system that we're under. But I can imagine someone saying, well, wait, this doesn't work for philosophy. Philosophy is doing something different. We would have to define religion first, or define, how prove Christianity or some kind of thing. And but one of the things I discovered about your work is that you have a very clear definition of philosophy that I can tell it's based off that Lutheran
it's influence.
Influence.
Definition of religion is what I start each of the 3 books and
exactly
a number of articles with that, because that's so important. There's a huge fuss today, all kinds of debates going on about,
because I remember
religion to politics, religion to science, religion to this and that and the other, and almost nobody ever bothers to define what it is.
Yeah, I looked up on the Merriam-Webster definition of it, and it says the first definition it gives is a personal set or institutionalized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices.
So you have to know what religion meant in order to know which ones those were.
So it's kind of a circular problem.
Yeah, not much help, no. Dooyeweerd does give a definition. And he uses the word absolute for the divine reality, and but he offers that definition simply as we say religion is this, and then he goes on, and I think that's not adequate. I think that we need to consider the definition compared to other definitions, see why they don't work, why this one does, and so on. So, but actually the first definition that I know of given anywhere is the one that I think is right. And it was given by the ancient Greek atheist philosopher Anaximander around 650 BC. And he said the divine is what has no beginning and no end and doesn't depend on anything.
Yep.
And in his book on the theology of the early Greek philosophers, Werner Jaeger points out that he knows of no such definition prior to Anaximander. And he argues that Anaximander got something really essentially right here. So Anaximander's saying, whatever you think it is that is completely independent. Now, the term I use is unconditionally non-dependent. And the shortcut term for that is self-existent. That's the term Calvin uses.
Yes.
He said, Calvin says, there is nothing so proper to God as eternity and self-existence. God is not in time and not dependent. There are two negative affirmations. And Anaximander even held that it didn't, that this didn't specify what is divine, it only specified what means to be divine. And people put different things in that slot, that divinity slot. In the history of Greece, as we know, there were people that said it was earth. No, it's air. No, it's fire. No, it's water. No, it's atoms. No, it's substances. It's forms. And they had all kinds of competing theories as to what it was that was divine.
So you could place anything into that.
That's right. That's right.
That slot.
And that's what. And in his better moments, Tillich treats religion that way too. But
in his better moments, yeah.
What he tried to do is slip in his own definition as the right one.
Right.
That it's what is infinite, and by infinite he meant there's nothing else besides that. So that gets him into the pantheism that everybody objected to, and there's a story about that too. When he was first at Union Seminary, because Reinhold Niebuhr helped get him out of Germany away from the Nazis. One morning he spotted a crocus on the lawn of the seminary. It was coming up through the snow, and he got down on his hands and knees and was brushing the snow away from it. And Niebuhr thought he was having a heart attack or something. He runs over, Paul, are you all right? And Tillich says, he's just the pantheist worshiping the flowers.
Interesting.
That's delightful.
Yeah. He was sensitive to that criticism, but it's essentially right.
Oh,
yeah. From my reading, and from what I've read before, I think it's correct.
But a wonderfully insightful person to study with, and especially when he goes through the history. The two courses that I had were self-interpretation of man from the ancient world to 1500, and then second semester is 1500 to the present, and the other was philosophy of religion. So
that's interesting.
All good stuff. Yeah. And so I'm defending the idea that the divine is whatever it is that is the self-existent reality that everything else depends on. That's two things. So there are, in some religions, what I call idol divinities. There are divine beings, and nothing about this world depends on them at all. They're just there. And so humans believe they're there, but don't care much about them. They care about the ones,
like avatars or something.
The ones that control. Well, I was thinking mainly of some Native American religions.
Oh, I see.
That have a whole realm of Wakan beings, but only certain ones of them are interested in humans and human life. They're all divine because they're self-existent, but then only some of them are involved with human life, and so they're the ones you're concerned with. You want them on your side.
So you're not dependent on them, so to speak.
On the others, that's right.
The others. Yeah.
That's right. So and then I think it is much clearer than why Dooyeweerd's first contention, the first thing that he will try to prove and show in the New Critique of Theoretical Thought, is that it's not possible to construct an ontology or an epistemology without assuming something in that role. Everyone, whether they do it consciously or unconsciously, puts something in the role of being the what it is that is unconditionally non-dependent, and everything else depends on it.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously this is the first thing someone thinks of is, well, not me. I don't believe in God or spirits or sprites or walk-ons or anything.
Right.
Nothing is dependent on anything. It's just a
one of my classmates
said
to me one time, "Show me anything that I hold it's a religious belief, and I'll give it up on the spot." So after the Myth of Religious Neutrality was published, I sent him a copy.
Dangerous game he's playing.
I said, "You remember that conversation we had, Buzz?" He was at that time dean of Boston College Law School.
Oh, okay.
So I sent him a copy and said, remember that conversation?
Here's a book. Here's a book about it.
He wrote back and said, there are a lot of things I have had to take back. He was very good-natured about it.
So then what is the God, so to speak, of someone who would deny that? What's completely independent and what they're dependent on?
Well, one big trend in philosophy right now is materialism. So the claim there is that it's the purely physical reality, whatever that is independent, self-sufficient, and generates everything else if there is anything else. So either everything is purely physical or it's dependent on the purely physical. So I end the book that I have out at the publisher now that I'm hoping they'll accept. I end that with an argument against materialism, an argument that shows why it's not possible to conceive of anything as purely physical. That's a pretty damning conclusion to
solid conclusion for me. That's a solid conclusion.
And it seems to me the argument has no comeback. It leaves them nowhere to go. And I've had lifelong naturalists say to me, and naturalist is the term we use in philosophy for someone who says there's no God, there's only the universe, there's only nature. And a lifelong, and the guy said to me, I don't know what I am now.
Yeah.
I can't be a naturalist and I don't believe in God, so I don't know what I am. I'm just lost.
Isn't kind of the tendencies then at that point to just kind of revert to a kind of emergentism that says there's some structures going on that are but you can't imagine that. It just it's hard for me to. Yeah.
You see that's right. But the point of an ontology, of a theory of reality, is to give the nature of reality, and everybody believes. Always thought that the way to do that is find the ultimate nature of reality. What is it all depends on? What makes it all the way it is? And then you've really got the key to understanding the reality that you live in and of which you are a part. So the materialist says it's the purely physical. And there are other people that have said, no, it's this, no, it's that, no, it's the other thing. The whole history of philosophy is a parade of these different proposals as to what it is that has independent existence and generates everything else. Spinoza used the term for it, what's that which is uncaused and unpreventable.
Oh,
that's another way to say
I like unpreventable. I like unpreventable. That's a nice
uncaused
term.
and unpreventable.
Yeah.
And that in Taoism, the I Ching refers to it as the unproduced producer of all else. Yeah.
The unmoved mover, something like that.
Yeah, that's a little different.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
But anyway, I think Dooyeweerd was right. It's not possible to construct a theory in science or philosophy that doesn't at least presuppose, and again I say whether that's consciously or unconsciously, something in the role as the ultimate reality, which is not dependent and everything else depends on it. Some kind of thing. While the materialists of today are much more sophisticated than the materialists of the ancient world because they have all the findings of physics to appeal to and fill in, but it's actually not helped them much because every proposal as to exactly what physical reality it is that's independent has turned out to be wrong. So no one hazards any guess today as to what are those things that are the ultimate building blocks of reality. It's the purely physical, but we don't know what those realities are. That's not quarks didn't work, protons didn't work, atoms didn't work. We don't know what they are, but when we find them, they will be the purely physical basis.
Right. They sort of
says it like a theory of everything. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, they sort of presuppose a coherence to reality, to to at least ascertain that there is some sort of truth that they are observing, right? Like, so they have to have some form of like formal presupposition of coherence, like that your mind, right, in the epistemological exchange can that you can see things as somewhat true as what they are, right? Like there has to be some sort of prior coherence or model that they're, like you said, whether it's unconscious or conscious, they have to have something that drives them and that they can make sense of the data, right? So materialists will have to have some sort of this is what we were talking about before, but but they won't. A lot of times, from my conversations with, I've actually met a few people that I go in my day to day who are kind of like, we talk about consciousness, but he's like a materialist about it. So, like, how do you sort of get to that space where, how do you understand that the consciousness and our self-reflection? And he's like, well, it just kind of happened, right? It just kind of came, it emerged, and it
emerges,
right? Yeah, it just kind of emerged. It built upon this and this and that, and it's like, well, how do you know that? Like, why?
What's the potential for it to emerge, though?
Right, like what? So it's just an interesting to see people, like you said, they're more sophisticated now because they have the neuroscience. Even though I think neuroscience is actually maybe moving away from a materialist in some areas view of things, but it's interesting to see like you said, the way that people are clever nowadays with all the other stuff.
Yeah. One of the things that Dooyeweerd does that I think is very helpful is that instead of just showing that everyone puts something into the divinity slot and builds on that, and that whatever they put in that slot pretty much regulates, rules how they
have to get creative about how they answer.
Yeah, how they go on to explain things. Sure. It doesn't hand the person their hypotheses. It's not that if you're a materialist, you'll come up with a hypothesis of atoms inevitably. No, you can be a materialist and come up with all kinds of different stuff, but you'll ultimately always interpret as controlled by the physical. But he not only shows that there's a religious conviction and leave you then with the obvious inference, therefore there ought to be a Christian or at least theistic theory of reality. One that, how do we start when we begin with our belief in God? Now, what kind of a theory do we construct? And in what sense can it be called Christian? But he goes on to give you a theory. He says, you want to see an example? Here's an example. And then all the rest of these 3 volumes are filled with this, with very original and very insightful hypotheses as to the nature of things and how we come to classify them into different types and so on. And and he doesn't do this in any kind of smug, self-satisfied way. One of the first things he said to me is, all my theories may need to be all changed or abandoned.
So he's open-minded.
He's very open. This is just one. Here's an example. You say to me, let's do a theory that doesn't reduce all the rest of reality to one aspect of the reality we live in, because it all depends on God, not anything in the universe. You say, well, what in the world would that look like? Okay, here's an example.
Yeah, that's good. Interesting. Try it on for size.
Yeah, and he constantly does that. He says, for the conclusions that he reaches in the hypotheses he proposes, it would be applied in physics this way, would be applied in psychology this way, in history this way, in mathematics this way, and so on. No, I need the people in those areas to tell me how this fits and how it changes and how it needs to be modified.
It's open source.
Tell me if I'm wrong. Yes.
There's a braveness to that, a courage to, a deep courage, I would say, to going and venturing out that way. Because you can stay in your little circular, Reformation philosophy circles and never go outside to be critiqued or, especially I remember as an early, like when I became a Christian early on, I was very fearful of a lot of arguments and things that I was hearing because I didn't know how to answer them. I didn't know how to make them, how to deal with them. So there's a courage there that I recognize that's wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Why don't I, since we've gotten this far with this, try to show you how I explain this to my freshman students.
Please.
Can I just ask one follow-up question to the religious definition issue, just for clarification? I notice, in the definition that the Merriam-Webster, one proposes, its first one, they really emphasize, system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices. And I know a lot of sociologists like to think of religion as something you practice, but I notice your definition that's not necessary to religious belief.
That's because I've shifted the subject a bit. Instead of starting by trying to define religion, I started by seeking a definition of religious belief.
Okay, interesting.
What does it mean for a belief to be a religious belief? How do we tell religious belief from one that isn't? And how is it that the same belief can be religious to one person and not to another? And I'm now going through this introduction that I use for freshmen. Okay. You and I both believe that 1 and 1 makes 2. We have a lot of them. We believe that. I believe last winter was exceptionally mild. I believe last ice age ended about 13,000 years ago. 1 and 1 makes 2, and that we're now in the spring of the year. Do any of those sound religious? No, they don't to us. But one of them was definitely a religious belief to the Pythagorean community that existed in the ancient world, because they believed that numbers were divine. Numbers are all self-existent and are what the world is made of. So 1 + 1 = 2 was a religious truth to them. Now, you and I both believe it's a truth, but we probably don't believe it's a religious truth. We don't think that numbers are divine. They actually had a prayer to the number 10. I reproduced it in the book. Bless us, that divine number, thou that generates gods and men, and it goes on and on. So how can we explain religious belief in such a way as to make sense of all of that? And that's why I took that the core meaning of religious belief is the belief in something as divine, where divine means has unconditionally non-dependent reality. Other things can depend on it, but it doesn't depend on anything. It's the independent reality. What it is that makes everything else the way it is. So there's 2 parts to that. It has independent reality, and all the dependent realities depend on it. It's possible for someone to believe in 2 divine principles. So part of the dependent world depends on one, part of the dependent world depends on the other. Or it may
dualism.
That's right. Or it may be that one part of each and everything depends on one divinity, and the other part of that thing depends on the other divinity. There are all ways of mix and matching it up and getting it to work out as an explanation of something. But whatever you put in that slot is divine by definition. Then there are auxiliary meanings for religious belief, and that's where religion per se comes in. We can have a specific description of what you want to put in that slot. That's a religious belief. We can have a specific idea of how the non-divine depends on the divine. That's also a religious belief. And we can have a belief about how humans come to stand in proper relation to the divine. And that's where we get religion
practice.
Because
I know some atheists who practice like meditation and stuff, but they wouldn't say that there's anything else that they're doing but like helping their brain or something,
Well, maybe, but Buddha
was practicing something.
Buddha himself was an atheist.
Okay.
He said he didn't know if there were any gods, but it didn't much matter, because even if there were, they couldn't help you. But he had a divinity. And that divinity is, remember, he was first a Hindu monk, and then he came up with his innovations.
Right.
And in Hinduism, the divine is called Brahmanatman. The divine is not an individual, it's not a person, it's not conscious. But the divine is just beingness itself. And it's the being out of which all else is made. So you and I and the chair you're sitting in and the screen you're looking at and everything is all made of Brahmanatman. But it's made in such a way as to be creaturely rather than divine. It's made in such a way that it doesn't reveal its divinity. That's why all the rest of reality is called, the reality that we experience is called in Hinduism Maya, illusion. Illusion doesn't mean there's nothing there. It means what's there fools you as to its real nature. Buddha was worried that even if we as talked about Brahmana that way, it would lead to people, since you're naming it, it sounds as though it is an individual, or it's a person, or it's someone you can talk to or ask for favors. So he sometimes used the term nothingness. Not a thingness.
Okay. Interesting.
It's not, we're not talking about really nothing whatever. We're talking about a reality that's not a thing, and it's not like anything else that we know. And other terms have arisen in Buddhism, suchness, dharmakaya. There are many different names. But Buddha thought that in names there was a danger, and that is that people begin to treat the divine as though it's another reality, like the world of Maya in which we live, move, and have our being. So Buddhism definitely does have a divinity, but it's not a god. That's
interesting.
And of course, the aim in life then is to bring your conscious individual life to an end and have it reabsorbed into Brahmana, into the divine, the way a drop is reabsorbed into the ocean. And that's when suffering ceases. That's the only way to have suffering cease. Life, to be alive and conscious, is to be in pain and to suffer. That's the Buddhist message. And there's no way out of that other than to have that life stop and be reabsorbed into the divine. But they definitely have a divinity.
So then when we get into Christian philosophy, Dooyeweerd's going to tease. This is one that he's offering up open source, saying this one works the best. Right? Is he saying something like that, or what is?
What he's doing is trying.
It's not really an apologetic.
No, it's not. The first thing he's trying to do is show why constructing theories in science assume some philosophical outlook.
Okay.
Assume that you can't construct a theory in psychology or physics or math or whatever the science is that doesn't assume an ontology and an epistemology. It assumes something about the way we know. It assumes something about the nature of reality that you're dealing with.
Okay.
Because every time you go to make a theory within a certain confine, suppose this theory is going to be a theory in biology or a theory in physics, but those theories don't come out the same for everybody. Why not? If you look hard at them, you find that they've assumed different things to be the divine reality that generates what they're talking about and trying to explain. So then you go to the philosophical theories. You say, well, if it pushes us back to philosophy, well, let's raise that issue. What do we say is the ultimate nature of reality and the ultimate nature of knowledge? Well, how do we deal with that? And then he says a Christian already has the answer to what the ultimate nature of reality is, to be been created by God. A God who transcends this world, is not part of this world, but can enter it and make himself known to his creatures within it. Now, the way in which that gives you a different view of reality is a bit complicated, and I have some drawings that I think help. See, and that's why I asked you, if I hold these up, will you be able to, your viewers able to see them? I see that the answer is yes. So let's do it this way. Philosophy was started by men who were pagans. That is, they believed this circle is the cosmos.
So we do broadcast this on podcast as well as video.
Okay.
Maybe you can describe it too.
A circle, that's the cosmos. That's the whole universe.
Everything.
And I put a D inside of it, and they're looking for what it is in the cosmos that's the divine reality.
Okay.
What is it in the cosmos?
Like a little piece.
Everything else in the cosmos depends on. What is it that is independent existence? Everything else depends on it. And that's when they came up with those different ideas that are famous, that in the ancient world people said that reality is essentially earth, no air, no fire, no, it's water, no, it's atoms and how they combine make things earth, air, fire, or water. No, it's forms, no, it's substances. No, the Pythagoreans said it's the numbers, and so on. We get all these different people.
Pagans are taking pieces of the universe or aspects of the universe that they experience and saying that's God.
That's the divinity. That's the divine reality. Now, when early Christians looked at that, Christian thinkers, right? I mean, the intelligentsia and the people that are doing philosophy and theology, they looked at that and they said, well, of course, that's not right. Nothing in the universe is divine. It's God that is, right? So they said the universe, the divinity isn't some part of the natural world at all. It's a transcendent creator who is, unlike anything else in the universe, all powerful and creates ex nihilo. That meant out of nothing. God didn't create the world of pre-existing material. He brought the material into existence and formed it. Okay. Now, that of course is correct. We all can applaud, right? Yes, that's the way to go. You're right on. But then they say,
simple
but look at this. You see, the pagan theories explain the rest of reality for how it depends on the divine. And we're saying, but God is the divinity that stands outside of the cosmos. However, that doesn't mean there isn't something in the cosmos that everything else depends on. Maybe there is. I mean, suppose we do it this way. Suppose we say everything else in the creation depends on this, and maybe
laws of logic or something.
It's matter or something. Yeah, or the laws of logic plus matter, or whatever, however we want to make it. And we say, oh, but everything else may depend on that, but that in turn depends on God. All right. So that what was wrong with the pagan theories was not that they tried to find what it was in the universe everything else depends on, but that they thought that was the divine right there. What they didn't see was that they have to say, even if they find that, and that in turn depends on God. That's how God creates and sustains the world. So one famous theory said, I'm trying to write it on there, that what everything depends on is matter and form. I put MF. Forms means the rational order of the universe. That's logic and math. And matter means the stuff that gets formed. Okay? So all things are to be explained in the world as how form and matter relate to one another. And the form gives us the definition of a thing, and the matter is the stuff that gets formed into that kind of a thing. So there's a form for
like
what
Plato and Aristotle a little bit. Yeah.
Those are
exactly. Influencers to the
more than a little bit.
Yeah.
Right. But and how do you make that acceptable to a Christian? You say God created the forms and God created the matter. And then after that, you explain everything just the same as old pagans do. It's the relation of form and matter that explains how things occur and why they are the way they are within creation. Now, this Calvinist idea is also shared by Eastern Orthodox theology.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an important point, that saying that this is okay. See, I'm holding that up now, that it's okay to say everything depends on something within the universe as long as you just add, and that in turn depends on God. That's a big howling mistake that you should not have said, because it contradicts what Scripture tells us in Thessalonians, where Paul says that God has created all things through Christ, visible and invisible. And in Christ, all things, the Greek says, hang together. Now, if God has created everything, and notice that visible or invisible is a tautology. It's what we call in logic a tautology. Everything's either visible or it's not. All right. So there are no exceptions here. God has created everything through Christ. And in Christ, all things hang together. That means that when you take something within the creation and you say that it's form plus matter, or it's just matter, or it's math plus matter, and so on, and you say that explains everything else, you have replaced Jesus Christ with that proposal.
Oh, interesting. So
it's only,
and that's interesting.
It's only Christ that hangs all the things together. There's a well-known philosopher among philosophers, a famous philosopher of science, is an American. His name is Wilfrid Sellers. And he was asked one time, what's philosophy about? And he said, philosophy is about how all things, in the widest sense of things, hang together in the widest sense of hang together. That's excellent.
Right. Very excellent.
Okay, and this text says, quite literally in Greek, and in Christ all things hang together. Not in the way form relates to matter, not in the way mathematics relates to sense perceptions or matter, or whatever else you're cooking up there. There is nothing in the universe that explains everything else in the universe. God doesn't funnel his creativity through some one or two things, two created things.
He's
so
directly,
so that you can take them as the imminent, the at-hand explanation of everything, and then just add, and that in turn depends on God. And then your of course your explanation is just the same as if you didn't add God. And God figures in this theory just the same way as the donkey's tail does on Pin the Tail on the Donkey with a birthday party. Just pin it on the donkey's ass at the end, and now it's Christian. Well, I don't think so. So if you go along with the Orthodox and the Calvinists, Dutch Calvinist group is saying, no, there's nothing in the universe that is what everything else in the universe depends on. It all depends on God. Then the really ultimate nature of everything creaturely is to be a creature. It's held together by God, by the divine nature of Jesus Christ, and nothing else.
I was reading Sergeius Bulgakov. What is it? The Bride and the Lamb. And it's interesting because he critiques Aristotle and the Western tradition in a lot of ways, with saying a lot of it's built on this idea of God as the unmoved mover. And it's almost like he can't get out of that system, and he keeps trying to fix it with Christianity, but it creates all sorts of problems. And he just says it's better for us to just think of God as creator and us as creature. And it's hard because that's so simple. The language seems so simple, it can't be right. It's like it is just the language of Scripture after all,
right? Like it's the simple language of Scripture.
Another way to put this conclusion would be to say there is no ultimate nature to creation, or the only ultimate nature is to depend on God. That doesn't mean there aren't really types of things in the world that are distinct. It doesn't mean there are no causal relations between them. But it means that we have to give an account of those natures by using the kinds of created properties and laws that exist in the creation, and explaining how they combine in the ways they do to form the things they do. But it's God who does that, who does the combining, the forming. So now, one major problem with this is that you are going to raise, if I don't raise it, is, well, in what sense is it Christian? I mean, we can say that God does this, but then why shouldn't this be acceptable to a Jew or a Muslim? They too believe in the transcendent creator God. Mm-hmm. We have three theistic, that's the general term for all, three theistic religions. All say there's a transcendent creator who called into being everything out of nothing and sustains it. And I asked Dooyeweerd that. And he said, well, it seems to me they should be open to this too. But then in what sense is your theory Christian?
Right.
See, and I think that there's an answer to that. And I proposed it recently at a conference on Dooyeweerd's philosophy. The reason is that it is only by the doctrine of the incarnation that we could know anything about the creator. If the creator is transcendent, that means the creator has called into being all the kinds of characteristics that we find true of things in the world. It's about how all things hang together. All right. That means God created the laws of logic. God created the laws of mathematics. God brought matter into existence, but God created time and space. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, if all those things are created, then what true statement can you make about God? How would you know anything? If God created the,
you just know He created them, but you wouldn't know anything personally.
Yeah, but I mean, what are you referring to when you say He? If God created a world in which there is quantity, and we assign numbers to quantity, we assign numerals, okay? Mm-hmm. But if that's created, and then it's not the creator, then what's left? What can you say that is true of the creator? And there have been two ways of answering that. And the prevailing one in Christian philosophy has been to say that that numbers and mathematical truths and logical truths and the perfections of all the qualities we find in this world are God. It's not that God created them. He didn't create them. God didn't create that 1 and 1 is 2.
We're thinking God's thoughts after Him.
God didn't create that contradictions can't be right. That's forced on Him by His own nature. Mm-hmm. Okay, and in the more Platonistic versions of this, the perfect blue is in God. The perfect square is in God. All the perfection. God is the being with all and only perfections, and the perfections are the maximal instances of all the qualities we find in creation, and all the necessary truths, the truths that couldn't be otherwise, like the laws of logic and mathematics. And that's why they do not accept this, right? It is not that God created everything that we experience about the creation. He created matter, and He created the things that are alive biologically, and He created all the contingent things, but not the necessary and not the perfections.
So does this play into, maybe I'm off with this, but does this play into the idea of secondary causes, where God is using secondary causes to then order everything else? So you're kind of placing Him behind a couple things.
I don't think so. I think that distinction can be used by both
sides.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
But this is where I think the answer to how these things are true of God comes in. Because my explanation, rather than saying, and the people who champion this view are the luminaries in Christian thinkers. This view that I'm bringing up and rejecting,
Augustine, Aquinas,
Anselm, sure. and the more modern versions occur in Descartes, Leibniz. You can keep on going. God is the being with all and only perfections. In the first place, well, I'm going to take some time with this, if you don't mind. In the first place,
please.
The Scripture never speaks about God as perfect, as perfections. A perfection is an instance of some quality or state of affairs that is the maximal degree. It's the highest it could be, the best it could be. So Scripture never speaks about that. The only place Jesus ever uses that term is when he says to his disciples, you should be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, if perfection meant divinity, he'd be telling them to be God. That doesn't make any sense at all. What he means, but the Jewish meaning of perfection is complete, not the highest possible instance. That's the Greek guy. What Jesus is saying to them is should be completely faithful to your end of the covenant as your Father is to his end of the covenant. It has nothing to do with Platonic perfections. Okay. And stuffing them back into God just wrecks everything. My proposal is that instead of doing that, taking that view and saying God's the being with all the only perfections, Plato had it right. That's what Augustine says. You know, Plato hit on it. He had it right. The Platonists, they just didn't know what to call it. They didn't. They thought the perfections were all individually independent. They didn't know that we're all combined in the unity of one God. But Plato did call the highest form the God and Father of all things. See, he got it right. No, he didn't. He absolutized, he deified some aspect of the creation instead of the creator. I think the answer to this is the reverse. And the answer is found in the incarnation. In the incarnation, a creature, the man, Jesus Christ, is taken into God. God takes into himself what is creaturely, so that God is the divine side of Christ and Christ is the human side of God. What the way Athanasius put this is this: it is not that in the incarnation our humanity became divine, but that the divine took our humanity into himself. Now, I'm saying my explanation for how God has all these properties that we can know about is the incarnational model. God has taken into himself one, being one.
Interesting.
Being rational and being loving and being merciful and kind and just and all the other things that we know about God are made possible in the same way that the incarnation works.
Interesting. Can I invite Anthony to share some questions or thoughts?
Yeah. Do you think? Yeah. No. I'm definitely. I would offer pushback, but I think part of me, when I understand of like divine simplicity and all those doctrines, that I think, you know, it speaks to the fact that God isn't a being among beings. Actually, he doesn't have being in any way like that we do, right? We're created, contingent.
Right.
And so the incarnation, to me, I agree with you. I think the incarnation is the answer. Like, I really do think that. And it sort of, you know, obviously there's a presupposition of like of Trinitarianism, right? Like there sort of has to be, I think, for it to be an answer. Just the way that God inhabits. And I agree that Athanasius has this sense of the human being drawn up into the divine, but also it is about the divine coming down into the created order, right? It is about the divine. I mean, obviously in Jesus you have fully God, fully man. You know, these. I mean, right? Like, so you wouldn't disagree with any of that stuff. Where does the sort of the Trinitarian element come into your thinking about the incarnation?
What I've been speaking of were only God's, what we call God's attributes, the properties that Scripture ascribes to God. So that God is personal, loving, just, all the rest of it. That means that God created such characteristics and took them into himself eternally. Then when he creates the world, he shares them with human beings. So God shares properties with humans, but humans do not share the uncreated being of God. If the properties that are ascribed to God are perfections in God, and they just are God, and he is the unity of them, which is what those three guys said, Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, then when you share a property, you share a part of God's being. That's partial pantheism.
Oh,
That's
interesting. So
it's unacceptable. And furthermore, it contradicts what few scriptures do speak of how God possesses his properties. Now, one of those places is Proverbs 8. It speaks about wisdom, and wisdom is a personification in the chapter. Wisdom is speaking. And she says of herself, I was the first of God's creatures. He created me before he brought forth the heavens and the earth. And I was with him through that process. And then I was with the children of men. Now here's an attribute of God that specifically says it's created.
interesting. So, and this is I can imagine people hearing this and like really trying to wrap their heads around it, because we're so used to just thinking of it the other way that you've critiqued. But I'm just trying to understand this. Would it, because there has to be some sense of where it's not arbitrary, where if we say there's no perfections in God, like his goodness, does that mean he could be evil, or does that mean
no? It just means there doesn't have to be a highest degree.
There's a degree. Okay,
so why does there have to be a highest degree? Why can't goodness be like the natural number series? There's no last number. That doesn't make the numbers less real or less important.
Yeah, because I can imagine someone thinking like,
possible.
Well, I look at myself.
Goodness.
I
don't know. Nobody's ever answered that question. Anselm raised it in the Monologion. He says, now some people ask why there has to be a highest. Well, he says, you never can say anything really important without some donkey braying. In other words, he doesn't have an answer.
Yeah.
He just makes fun of the people that ask the question.
Yeah.
And I don't know of anybody that has ever answered it in all the years since.
So is goodness a part of the created order then, and not a part of God?
Goodness is something that it's created in the sense that it depends on God.
Right. So then it must have its origin in God, though, right?
That's right.
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 So I think, I mean, I this might just be my classical Platonist Christianity peeking out, but I mean, I think there must be a sense in which, because what Nick was saying about the arbitrariness of this, I think if we talk about goodness purely as like a set of numbers or something, I feel like that borders on that becomes arbitrary at some level. If it is, and I think you would agree that goodness does have its origin in God. Sure. Right, like you agree. I don't think we disagree.
Absolutely, there. No.
Right. I mean, he's taking it into him. He's saying, "I am good." So he's he's. It's like it's on the incarnational model, right? He's. This is an incarnation. In fact, we'd probably say that somehow, if you say it all hangs together in Christ, how do we know God is good? It's what we see in Christ.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a vantage thing too. You're getting at too. I think, which I agree with. I think when we talk about human knowledge and encountering the world, I do think the incarnation is the way to understanding. That isn't arbitrary, and that through So I don't think there's much disagreement here.
The way I'm applying that is that how do these properties get to be true of God? Well, because God has brought them into existence. They depend on him, but because he has taken them into himself, it's the same way he took into himself the whole person of Christ. See, you're stuck with one of two options. Either the elements of the uncreated God are true of us, or elements of what is created in us are true of God. The first one's pantheism.
Right.
And it flatly contradicts Proverbs 8. What I said in the book when I said Proverbs 8 was no Augustinian or Anselmian could have written Proverbs 8 drunk, let alone sober. They cannot accept what is there on the page. Augustine said, well, whatever this is talking about, it can't really mean God's wisdom. Well, that's what it says. What do you mean it can't mean God's wisdom? Wisdom says, I was with God from the beginning. Before he made the heavens and earth, he made me. Okay. There isn't much in Scripture about that sort of thing, about how God possesses his properties. But there is a lot about God's faithfulness and his not going back on his promises and so on. And as to this diversity, of properties, but also persons of the Trinity, one of the Orthodox theologians, I think said it in a wonderful way. Now, I won't get every word exactly the same, but it's close. Out of a superabundance of love for us, God has imposed upon himself a really diverse mode of existence. And that's what he reveals. The two things have to happen for us to know God. God has to make himself knowable. So in a sense, anthropomorphize himself. And then he has to reveal that to us. He has to tell us that he did it and how and within what limitations. And he has to really do it, and then he has to tell us. And that's how we know God. So
yeah, I think what Calvin says, God stutters for us to be able to understand, or something to that effect, right?
Yeah. Well, but this goes deeper than that. It isn't just that God uses analogies or something like that.
Right.
Calvin says the way a nurse lisps for little children, so on. It's more profound than that, because it has to do with how God can have those properties at all. See,
the problem with a golden calf is a problem with an idol, a golden calf, is that you're trying to make God into something and give him properties, whereas but he didn't choose, or instead he chooses Christ. And,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So
and that applied to the properties too. Yeah.
Yeah. It applies to God's attributes and persons. They are all equally God because they are of the same being. But then if God chooses three personalities in which to relate to us, it's God replicating himself three times. And St. Palamas puts it, has imposed upon himself a really diverse mode of existence, and then made it known. So the sense in which this is a Christian theory, it's not, is that there's something acceptable about it to other theists as well. But then they have a big blank where you try to explain, well, then how can we say anything about God to have it be true? Even that God is one. And I know that some commentators like to say that God, that the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And they say, well, that doesn't mean numerically particularly. It means he's unique. But you can only be unique if you're one numerically. It still assumes the numerical meaning. It may be more than that. It is more than that. But it has to be at least that.
Yeah, interesting. So what are some of the implications then of thinking about Christian philosophy in this incarnational orientation or presupposition?
Well, I think Dooyeweerd's given us a good model for how to understand how it would go. And a lot of and he arrived at a lot.
So metaphysics, epistemology, how things hold together, as you said.
Now, what Dooyeweerd did, but we should be clear, is he sketched out an ontology.
Okay.
And in some detail, he has a section in that book called "The Epistemological Problem Viewed from the Point of View of This Ontology," and he sketches ways in which epistemology would be guided, but he does not produce an epistemology.
Okay, so he's letting someone else take that.
That's right.
That role. So he's doing ontology.
Yeah. And I didn't try to supply an epistemology either. In the new book, Can we know God is real? I go through this stuff about what the early Christian theologians did, the Augustine Anselm Aquinas answer, in some detail, and why it won't work, and why this incarnational model succeeds where the other fails. There's a whole section that's part 3 of the book. And then we come to the epistemology. When we come to that, I deal with that as the epistemology of belief in God. Just that, not an entire epistemology.
Not a working philosophical.
But how does coming to know God work, and why does it count as knowledge? And I argue there that the Scripture's own account of how people come to know God is still in force and is still the right one. People know God because they experience God. That's why. It's not a theory. It's not a hypothesis. It's not the conclusion of an argument. It's an experience report.
Yep, completely
agree. Properly basic, would you?
And if you ask how do you know the experiences of God, the answer is that's what's self-evident. That's like asking, how do you know that this tree is a tree? Well, because I experienced the tree. And it's self-evident to me that it's a tree. Well, does that mean I can't ever be wrong? No, there's nothing about us that's infallible.
It's
I'm a
fallibilistic account.
Yeah. It's not infallible. Nothing about us is infallible. But it can and is the case that often we have overwhelming reasons for believing something is true, and virtually nothing but somebody's bare doubt to think that it might be false. If there's no good reason to think it's false, and there's every good reason to think it's true, it's true. So I have a section in that called the rescue and restoration of self-evidence as a means of knowledge. That's what present-day epistemology has come to reject. They call that the modern view. The modern view, that by modern they mean Descartes and Leibniz and people like that. Modern, they talked about the axioms that couldn't be wrong because they were self-evident, and then they reasoned from them and so on. And all that has collapsed. And all that's collapsed because in the ancient world, Aristotle put restrictions on self-evidence.
Right.
Aristotle says there must be a parity between what is most real and what is most knowable. Now, the most real things are what he called substances. That includes the laws of logic. Okay. So only those things are self-evident. They are allowed to count. Only if something is a necessary truth known to everybody and nobody disagrees, is it really self-evident? And that rules out the vast majority of what's self-evident to everybody all day. Everybody on earth, all day long, experiences dozens and dozens and dozens of things as self-evidently true. That we're having this conversation. I mean, normal sense perception is
looking at my computer
example, and he rules that out. That can't count as self-evident.
Okay.
Because it could be wrong.
Doesn't fit his criteria.
You can get things wrong, and so he sets up restrictions that nothing can meet. He thought only his logical truths could meet. Actually, they don't meet them either. And that's why self-evidence fails. If you throw out the restrictions. Now, what I said was, at one point, Aristotle put 3 main restrictions on self-evidence. Descartes repeated them at the beginning of modern philosophy, and he made one of them worse. But if anybody has ever done this, I have not come across it. Take each one of them individually and show why they're self-referentially incoherent. They cannot be met. They cannot be known to be met. And there's tons of evidence against every one of them. I took each one of them and showed why each one of them is crap. And then when you toss them out, now self-evidence comes back in the form in which everybody experiences it all day long.
Do you connect the incarnation to this? I think it's it could be an interesting connection about, sorry, got my 2-year-old here. the embodiment of human beings and our ability to understand the world. Have you thought about connecting those?
No, I didn't. I didn't.
Okay.
What I did do was say then that all the different divinity beliefs that people have, that it's matter, that it's the laws of logic plus matter, that it's the laws of logic or mathematics plus matter, and all the different theories, and that it's God, they're all believed because they're self-evident to the people that believe them. And a lot of naturalists are coming to this kind of conclusion also. They're saying, well, we don't have proof. We don't have an argument that shows that we're right. But we believe that this is the only way science can work, for example. Well, science can't work at all on that basis. So what I did was say, we can't analyze their experience of self-evidence, and they can't analyze ours. Neither of us are in a position to say the experience is faulty. What we have to do is take the beliefs that result from them and test them. And this is another important thing that I bring out in the new book that I don't think anybody has said before. If they have, I hadn't run across it. But everybody, all day, every day, experiences dozens and dozens and dozens of things as self-evident and tests them. That's the natural, spontaneous reaction of a human being, is to test them. Even if we come up with an axiom, well, is it?
Yeah, if I just say, hey, if I make up something, you want to know if I made it up, or?
Yeah, sure, but we test an axiom to see if it's consistent with other axioms.
Exactly.
And at times, there's famous examples of it's not working. The father of modern symbolic logic came up with a set of axioms for set theory, and Bertrand Russell constructed a proof that it was inconsistent. So one of them had to be false. So something can seem to be an axiom and not be. Something can seem to be a normal sense perception and not be. We're fooled. Something can seem to be a clear memory, but we got it wrong. So there are all kinds of things, but among the things that are self-evident to us all day, every day are our name, address, and telephone number. Memory beliefs.
Sometimes telephone number escapes me, but no.
That's right. We won't talk about that. Don't say memory to old people. It upsets us. But we have all kinds of things that are self-evident to us, and we test them. And my argument that closes the book is that when you take some aspect of the universe, the physical, the logical, the numerical, whether you're a Platonist or a Pythagorean or a materialist or when you take that and then you try to test it, you can't. First of all, because you can't conceive of any specific thing, event, or specific state of affairs as purely that. You can't form the concept. And secondly, you can't form any concept of how to test it. But belief in God can be and is tested all day, every day. People do it all the time. In fact, there are some people that test it, say it didn't pass, and I give it up. Right?
Mm-hmm.
People, but belief in God has.
I prayed and it did, yeah.
There are all kinds of ways to test that, and I go through any number of them.
Oh, that's interesting.
At the end, materialism can't be tested. Here's why. But look at what happened when we do it with belief in God. With this test, this test, this test, this test. People regularly do this all the time.
Mm-hmm. So you're basically you're testing people's defeaters, right, or something like that. Yeah. So this is
testing your belief to see if the test is a defeater.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, wow. Well, I'm excited for your book to come out. I hope that it comes out it comes out soon this year, whatever.
I hope so too. I'd like to live to see it.
Yeah. So, yes, Roy Clouser. I'll just mention a couple of the books before we, close. The Myth of Religious Neutrality. Is that your first one?
I wrote that first, but that in logical order would come last.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so this would be even after your new one.
No, the new one would come first. The one that's not published yet.
That would be first.
That's Can We Know God is Real? Now, if we
Can
do,
we know
then
God?
how should that impact theories? Then that's what goes on in the Myth of Religious Neutrality.
Okay.
In between comes a little popular book that summarizes some of the conclusions of the one that's not been published yet.
And I like it because it's kind of got a Socratic approach to it, like you're talking to one of your students or something.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Knowing God with the heart.
I've been asked who it was that was my interlocutor there. And that's a great compliment to think that it reads realistically enough that there was really someone else.
Sounds like there's another person
trying to zing me. Yeah.
I think that's the best way that I've discovered just engaging these topics deeper with people is very Socratic, very conversational, really trying to get them to draw what they think and try to have them trying to have them test their ideas and with my argument. So yeah, it's the best way to do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Roy Clouser, for joining us on Discerning the Forms. And we got to have you on again.
My pleasure. I'd be happy to.
One of the things I know that you've written a lot of papers on is God and creation, and kind of dispelling some of the different views that have kind of come up in Christianity that have created problems, especially for doing science and so forth. Because I think one of the promising things of Dooyeweerd with his philosophy is that you can really apply it to all sorts of different things, and you can apply it to science. Yeah. So we definitely.
The field where it's been applied most is one that Dooyeweerd continued on from Kuyper, and that's political theory.
Yeah, interesting.
So a specific
political theory would be good.
Christian view of the government of the state, of the institution of the state in society, and what government should and shouldn't be doing, and so on. It gives you a clear criteria for that.
Yeah, and I think that's important too, because often people are just picking up what they get from the news. Christians, I love, are picking up what they get from the news or political parties. But for us to think about it in a Christian, if there's a Christian philosophy of everything, as you're saying, and we can apply the incarnation to everything,
then there's Christian political philosophy.
Political philosophy. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you.